And with that, we'll get started, and I'll introduce our speaker tonight, who is Brooks Jensen. Brooks is a fine art photographer, publisher, workshop teacher, and writer. He publishes an award-winning blog or newsletter called LensWork, which has been going on now for, it's in its 29th year in 72 countries. He also does a podcast on fine art photography that's heard worldwide. Brooks has published 10 best-selling books on photography and creativity, and does a number of workshops and has a new theme that he'll be hopefully sharing with us as a way of doing his workshops. His photography work is fantastic. Tonight, Brooks is going to be speaking on those who inspire me and why. Brooks will be giving us inspirational examples about photography and art, and he'll talk about his project-oriented photo works and give many examples from people that he has felt to be very influential for his creative development. And with that, Brooks, I'll hand it over to you. I'll ask everyone to mute their mics, and then you can add your questions into the chat room, and I'll ask those of Brooks as the time is appropriate. So okay. Welcome, Brooks, and thanks so much.
Well, thanks, Vince. I'm delighted to be here. Wherever here is, these Zoom meetings are just fascinating, aren't they? That we're all over the place. I just did one last week for the Royal Photographic Society in London. I've never even been to England. I think this is fascinating. But real quick, just so that I have a feel here, can you guys wave your hands if you're familiar with LensWork, just so that I can see how many of you know something about LensWork? Some of you. Okay. Well, let me flip over to my share screen mode. And hopefully,
we're good, Brooks.
Hopefully you can see that. All right. For those of you who aren't familiar with LensWork, let me, if you'll indulge me for just a minute, I'll explain why I'm here and why I am involved in these kinds of Zoom meetings. LensWork is, as Vince said, been being published for 29 years. My wife and I started it. The first issue came out in September of 1993. We were both photographers when we met and eventually got married. We started publishing LensWork, as you can see on the left, in 1993 as a black and white only magazine, because both Maureen and I were black and white photographers. But to be honest, I kind of hesitate to use the word magazine, because magazine brings a certain kind of thing to mind, a certain size, a certain paper, a certain printing quality, etc. And that's not at all what LensWork is. We publish every other month, so it comes out 6 times a year. We have no advertising, unlike most magazines. It's just about photography and pictures, and we use museum quality printing. And so it's quite a bit different than any other publication you've ever seen. In 2005, we started doing an extended version, for the simple reason that so many wonderful submissions came in, and we only have a limited number of pages in the print publication, that we thought, well, let's do a PDF version where we can include more images. So LensWork Extended was born in 2005, and then we began a tablet edition in 2011 with the popularity of iPads and all of that kind of stuff. We've also published a number of books. I'll talk a little bit about some of the books that we publish. And we have a new book that'll be published in 2021 called Our Magnificent Planet. It'll be 300 of the best photographs we can find from people who enter. And we did it last year and it was fantastic. Turned out to be a great book. And so we'll do it again this year. Our latest edition is LensWork Online. And the talk that I'm going to give tonight actually comes from LensWork Online. LensWork Online is our membership uh, website, so it's available to members at 2 levels. And if you're at all interested in inspiration and some of the things that I talk about tonight, there will be more there. There's a $10 trial, so it's not going to cost you a bunch of money to get involved. But this talk does come from LensWork Online, and it's titled "Those Who Inspire Me and Why." And this talk got started in sort of an odd reason. I was out photographing with a friend of mine, and we were talking, as so often happens in photographic circles, about people that we really admire, and we happened to be talking about Ansel Adams. And I said to this friend of mine that Ansel Adams has been a tremendous influence in my photographic life, but not for the reason you would think. That he was inspiring to me, not because of his imagery, although I love his imagery. I'm not necessarily compelled to try to do that kind of imagery, but I was so inspired by Ansel Adams because what he taught us all about getting your work out into the world with his posters and calendars, and it went on and on and on. And I found that particularly inspiring. And this friend of mine said, you ought to write a book. And I thought that could be fun. So I did. I didn't publish it as a book, however. I published it as a series of audio essays. These are the people who were involved in this project. So I've put together little essays about all of these photographers and how they've inspired me and what I've learned from them and what I'm hoping I can pass on through this project. A lot of these photographers, I attended workshops and learned from them there. The ones that are in the red color, or well, it's kind of orangey red, are the ones that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So there's a lot more to explore if you find this an interesting presentation tonight. I have to begin, however, by saying that my first and biggest inspiration was my wife, Maureen Gallagher, who I mentioned passed away last September. She was a photographer, I was a photographer, and we actually met at a group function where 2 photo clubs were getting together in order to share work and spend a social evening. We both remember being at that meeting, but we don't remember meeting each other. And a year later, we happened to meet, and um, I was really quite taken aback by her, and asked her if she would like to go out on a date, and she said yes. And to make a very long story very short, 90 days later, we were married. And we were married for 28 years until she passed away last September. But one of the interesting things that happened in our very early days is 2 photographers, talking shop as people do. And she said, "What magazines do you subscribe to?" And I said, "Well, I don't subscribe to any photography magazines because they're not about photography. They're about cameras. And fundamentally, I'm not interested in cameras. I'm interested in photographs. What magazines do you subscribe to?" She said, "Same reason. I don't subscribe to any photography magazines. I already own my camera, so they don't have much to offer." Then she asked what is the fateful question. She said, "Well, if you were to subscribe to a magazine, what would it look like?" And I said, "Well, I can not only describe it, I can show you." And I went to my bookshelf and pulled off the bookshelf one of the very early issues of Aperture magazine from the 1950s when Minor White was publishing it. And I said, "This is what I would like to subscribe to. It's all about pictures. Occasionally, he would include a poem and maybe sometimes a little essay or a short couple of paragraphs about the creative life." And she said, "Well, why don't we publish such a thing?" And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about the magazine business. I don't know anything about commercial offset printing. I don't know anything about distribution." And she said, "Who cares? Jump in. Let's just do it." And so I started by keep in mind, this is in 1993. I found a piece of software that would allow me to do some publishing called Publish It, which you have to say very slowly. And this was long before Microsoft Publisher, long before Adobe InDesign. And we set off to do publishing. And the first few issues of LensWork were pretty sketchy. We refer to them as Brooks Learns All About Fonts, because I thought, having more fonts was better, and slowly learned that no, more pictures are better. We eventually bought a press, which we named Elvis Presley. This is me learning how to put ink on me. Took me a long time to learn how to put ink on paper, but um, and yes, that's one of Maureen's model's legs, a little hosiery leg in the background. That was her contribution to the press room. We published the first 11 issues of LensWork on this press before we sort of grew up. This is what it looked like, this one on the left. I don't know, can you see my mouse if I illustrate something with my mouse? Okay. This one on
Yes.
the left is volume 1, number 1. It was 8.5 by 11, folded and stapled in the middle. Then we made a smaller version that had more pages. By this point, it was up to 60 pages. Eventually, we started including photographs, and we've grown to now this, full-blown publication. Like I say, it comes out 6 times a year. We have subscribers in 73 countries, and I'm having a ball. I've learned a lot about commercial offset printing, and all of this I have to thank Maureen for, because if she hadn't given me the nudge to jump in where I didn't know what I was doing, none of this would have happened. Now, the reason I include this story is for background for why I'm here in front of you tonight, but also because I think there's a valuable lesson there. Just because you don't know how to do something in photography doesn't mean that you shouldn't jump in, because that's what the art life is all about. It's about learning. It's about trying new things. It's about stretching. And if you're doing something that's comfortable perennially, that's probably an indication that you're not trying enough new things, not gambling, not experimenting. And so why not? So the first individual I want to talk about, who is a photographer who's inspired me in a very specific way, is Pedro Meyer. Now, I thought everybody knew who Pedro Meyer was, but I've recently done a number of these Zoom talks and learned that a lot of people have not heard of Pedro Meyer. He's a Mexican photographer. He has a terrific website called zonezero.com. And Pedro Meyer taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my photographic life, and that is the difference between an image and a print. Now, keep in mind, I started photography in 1970. It was when I first picked up a camera. And back then, if you didn't make a print, there wasn't a photograph. Well, maybe you could say slides are an exception, but we'll set those aside. For all intents and purposes, the word photograph and print were the same thing. They were different terms for the same thing. Pedro Meyer started me rethinking media. And by that, I mean this. I had been taught, and I suspect a lot of you, this will sound very, very familiar. I was taught that the core essence of photography is first making a spectacular image. You created something with a combination of composition and camera controls and negative development and printing, and you made a magical print, which you then probably were taught to place inside a white mat board. And by the way, this is so codified as to be almost inviolable. If you do like black mat board, oh no, you're an amateur. If you do 2-ply mat board, oh no, you're an amateur. Has to be 4-ply, has to be white, has to have a bevel cut, and then you top it off by signing it in the lower right-hand corner and giving it some kind of number. Of course, this isn't Harry Potter, but it emphasizes the point about a magical photograph. This is Ansel Adams' Clearing Winter Storm. And for many, many, many of us, this is what photography has been. Well, I should maybe clarify that by saying fine art photography, personally expressive photography has been this kind of thing, which we put in a frame, hang on the wall above the fireplace, etc. Pedro Meyer opened my eyes to the fact that there were some alternatives. I was doing exactly the formula and had done exactly the formula for, oh gosh, 15 years before I discovered Pedro Meyer. I was wandering around a Fry's electronics store looking for software, and I ran across this little CD by Pedro Meyer with a photography project in it called I Photograph to Remember. And in this project, his father and his mother were both quite elderly, and his father had gotten cancer and his mother was taking care of him. Later, she got cancer and they were taking care of each other. And he told this story in a series of black and white photographs with, oops, sorry, doggone it. Told this story with a series of photographs and voiceover where he was telling the story. It was still photography, so I could relate to that. It was black and white photography, so I could relate to that. But the story that he told with the voiceover was simply mind-boggling to me. And it got me thinking, took me a long time to sort all of this out, but it got me thinking about what about photography outside the mat board? And that led to a number of projects, which I'll get into in just a minute. But it all started with Pedro Meyer, and what he really taught me was the difference uh, between image and print. The image can be manifest in a print, but the image can also be in all kinds of other media. So Pedro Meyer started me thinking about other media. And the minute I started thinking about other media, a problem cropped up, or I should say a challenge cropped up. And the challenge was when you take your magical photograph and you mat it and you frame it and you put it on the wall, it stands all by itself. It's a singular thing. But the minute you take photography off the wall and start putting it in some kind of other medium, then all of a sudden it needs some brothers and sisters. And the idea of working in projects came to mind. So let's talk about projects for a bit. And that gets started with Jerry Ewelsman, who is the next individual I want to talk about. Now, again, I'm assuming that a number of you are familiar with Jerry Ewelsman, but maybe you're not all familiar with him, so I'll explain. Jerry Ewelsman is a younger generation than Ansel Adams, and he's quite well known for his recombinant imagery. Jerry would take bits and pieces from various negatives and expose them onto the enlarging paper and assemble images that didn't exist in real life. One of his most famous ones is a picture of a nude, standing nude, hovering above a surface of water about 3 or 4 feet, and she has angel wings. And so it's completely imaginative, and it's constructed from all of these parts. We had an opportunity to publish Jerry back in LensWork number 17 in 1997, and I interviewed him for that issue. And I asked Jerry, I said, when you're out in the world with your camera and you're making pictures, are you thinking about how you're going to use these images and these recombinant constructions that you put together? He said, no, no, no. He said, when I'm out in the world, all I'm doing is gathering assets. He said, for me and the kind of work I do, all the creative aspects of photography take place back in the darkroom. When I start looking at my contact sheets and figuring out how I'm going to combine various things in a single image in order to create one of these images from my imagination. The key word for me was gathering assets. Now, again, I started photography in 1970, and like many of you, I suspect, my introduction to the craft of photography was through those great Ansel Adams books. the print, the negative, etc. And the big theme that went through those Ansel Adams books was pre-visualization. The idea is you would look at the world, you would see something that you would want to photograph, and you would have it fixed in your mind's eye before you click the shutter. And then you would invoke whatever technique was required in order to make manifest the vision in your mind's eye. Jerry Ewelsman said just exactly the opposite. He said, when I'm out in the world, I'm just gathering assets. I'm not making artwork there. I'm getting things that I can take home and make artwork later. It was the opposite of pre-visualization. And I have to tell you, for me, it was an earth-shaking moment because I was never very talented at pre-visualizing how I wanted my images to look. But once I got them back in the darkroom, or in the digital darkroom these days, and started playing with them, I found I could do lots of interesting things, not all of which I could have predicted. That Jerry's method of gathering assets sort of introduces the element of random chance, and I liked that. So he implanted in me the idea that art making doesn't happen with the camera in the field. Well, it can, but it doesn't have to. That it can also happen back in the darkroom when you start combining assets. And that really manifested itself in this project I call Wakari Masen. I'll talk more about this later, but here's just the quick introduction. This is a project that was photographed over the course of several trips at a World War I military battery that was on the Puget Sound up here in Washington State. And it was miles of bunkers and cement walls, and the kids go in and they, draw dirty pictures and stuff. And the park rangers come in and cover it all up. And in this particular park, they cover it all up with these brushstrokes of paint, which looked to me like some sort of calligraphy. I went to this place to photograph doors and windows and architecture, but what captivated me was these little swatches of paint. And so I gathered assets, following Jerry Ewelsman's advice. I made about 800 of these abstracts of little paint squiggles and whatnot, working my way from room to room, wall to wall. I loved the work. It was fascinating. I have a soft spot for these kinds of abstracts, but I had no idea what to do with them. But based on Jerry Ewelsman's advice, the one thing I did know how to do was to gather assets. And so I did. And as a matter of fact, the idea of gathering assets is you never know how you're going to use them. This little bit of paint right here on this wall has morphed into the cover of 3 of my books. So you never know how you're going to use a bit of photographic miscellany when you photograph it, and it may be in places that aren't photographic by nature. So gathering assets implies, this is the big point, gathering assets implies that what you have already in your possession is enough material to probably work for the rest of your life. If you couldn't take another picture with your camera, all those assets that you have in your negatives and your digital files can be turned into projects. Well, how do you do that? How do you turn miscellaneous assets into projects? And this brings us to David Bales. David Bales is a wonderful photographer. He's an inspired workshop instructor. And he's also the co-author with Ted Orland. Some of you may know Ted Orland. He's was one of Ansel Adams' early darkroom assistants. David and Ted have known each other for years, good friends, and they wrote this little book called Art and Fear: Observations on the Perils and Rewards of Art Making. If you are not familiar with this book, This is what I would consider a mandatory read for any photographer who's pursuing art. It's not strictly about photography, it's about the art life, and it's about the process of being a creative individual. Very short little book, 100 and, I don't know, 20 pages or so, but literally it's a mandatory read. Well, anyway, David Bales was teaching a workshop that I attended in the late 1980s. And we were talking about project-oriented work. And I asked him, I said, well, David, how do you go about finding a project? How do you go about selecting the images for a project? He said, oh, that's easy. I'll give you the technique that works beautifully. And now I'm going to pay that forward by sharing it with you. And it is a marvelous technique. David said, here's the way it works. Gather together a large pile of prints. You know, you can do this in Lightroom too. They don't have to be prints. And then go through the large stack of prints and divide it into two piles based on some criteria. So for example, all the horizontal compositions go to the left, all the vertical compositions go to the right. Divide the pile. And when you're done, you'll have two piles. If nothing happens to you in that process, don't worry about it, he said. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Put the pile all back together again and come up with another criteria to divide the pile. Maybe all the ones that have curvy compositions and all the ones that have linear or angular compositions. Divide the stack of prints into two piles. If nothing happens to you, don't worry about it. Put it back together, come up with another criteria. All of those that are photographed closer than 15 feet, all of those whose subject is farther away than 15 feet. Nothing happens, put them back together, another criteria. All those that have a shallow depth of field, all those that have a great depth of field. He said, just keep doing this over and over, as many different dividing criteria as you can come up with. He said, eventually, absolutely guaranteed, eventually you will divide the pile in half and say, oh my God, there it is. It'll leap out at you. He said, the problem with looking through your prints for a project is it's kind of searching for a needle in a haystack full of needles. But by dividing it, you'll find a criteria that exists in the work that you have that you maybe you're not conscious of, that you never even knew existed. And so that's what I did, is I used his technique with a pile of prints from all of these little paint things that I had been photographing. And until I found this one, and I said, you know, this looks like the Chinese and Japanese calligraphy for the number 1, which is a horizontal brushstroke slightly rising to the right. That's how they write the number 1. That was a new criteria I hadn't used before. So I took my 800 abstracts of little paint swatches and I divided them. Those that look like calligraphy and those that don't look like calligraphy. And there was obviously a lot more that didn't look like calligraphy than ones that did. But once I had the group that did kind of look like calligraphy, I realized that that was the basis for a project. And the project is Wakari Masen, which is Japanese for I don't understand. These are things that to me look like they should be writing of some kind, but in a foreign language that I don't comprehend. And it reminded me of the first time I went to Japan. I had done something that I thought was very clever. I hired a tutor to teach me a little Japanese so that I could have a little bit of language skills. And it worked very well. But the minute I landed in Japan, I realized that I had neglected to learn how to recognize the written characters. So I was absolutely perfectly illiterate. That became this project. Wakari Masen, I don't understand in Japanese. That was the title, and it had a little paragraph that introduced that, and then a bunch of these images that looked like calligraphy. So I found a project that I didn't even know I had. I found a project that I wasn't even consciously photographing when I was out photographing, because all I was doing was gathering assets. And what I'm proposing is that each and every one of you have little projects like this buried in your massive pile of negatives and digital files and Lightroom catalogs and etc. And it can be the most creative and fun thing to start thinking about putting together little projects. So here are a few more of the images from Wakarimasen. The next individual I want to talk about is Hokusai. Since we've just been to Japan, let's talk about Hokusai. You probably know Hokusai. He's most famous for this iconic Japanese woodblock print known as the Great Wave off Kanazawa. And we could have a long discussion about why I've included him, but let me make it very short. That photography is very much like Japanese woodblock prints in that they are, along with music, probably the only three art media that are infinitely reproducible. A painting is not infinitely reproducible. A sculpture is not infinitely reproducible, but a Japanese woodblock print is, and a photograph is, and music on a CD or something like that is. These three media have a lot in common in terms of distribution. But Alfred Stieglitz didn't see it that way when he tried to elevate photography to be an art medium. He cast his eye about and looked around and said, I think photography is like painting. And so he tried to make photography a kissing cousin of painting, if you will. Mat it, frame it, hang it on the wall, put it in an art gallery, and pricing followed suit. And so photographs tend to be fairly expensive. Even a fairly unknown artist is going to want to probably get $200 to $500 to $800 for a print. And, famous photographers get more than that, but way less than famous painters get. So Hokusai taught me something about, of all things, marketing of photographs. Because in Japan, those woodblock prints were sold for what you and I would think of as a penny. They were sold very inexpensively to the masses. And for 200 years, it was a dominant form of art media in the Orient. And if a woodblock print can be infinitely reproduced and sold inexpensively, why can't photographs? So that set me on a path that I would have not predicted. Up until that point, I was involved in galleries and I was selling work for expensive prices and etc. But when I got introduced to Japanese woodblock prints, I changed my thinking. And I decided that what I would rather do is make my work affordable so that anybody could have access to it. I did not want there to be a financial barrier between my work and someone who enjoys it. So I do inexpensive things. I sell these little well, they're printed on 13 by 19 paper, so they're 8 by 10 prints, roughly speaking. I sell these as sample prints for $25, similar to the way Ansel Adams did his special edition prints that you can buy in Yosemite. I do handmade artists' chapbooks that are 2 sheets of paper folded, sewn in the middle, have multiple images, often a little text, a little story. I do these little folios. So my work became off the wall, out of the gallery, and I pursued a completely different form of distribution. This is such a huge topic. I feel really guilty about just scratching the tiniest surface of it here. I did a workshop on this topic called um, finding an audience for your work. And as much as I tried to keep it contained, that workshop ends up being a 14-hour video, or 14 hours worth of videos, and it is available at LensWork Online. But it's a huge topic for me. Hokusai brought that to life. Charles Dickens was another big inspiration for me about project-oriented work in an odd way. Why Charles Dickens? Well, Charles Dickens' first book was called Sketches by Boz. Boz was his pen name. This was before he was famous. He was a young man at this
Wow.
point, I think 24 years
Yes.
old, as I recall. And
Okay.
he worked for the newspaper at the time.
Yeah.
And the newspaper, I'm hearing someone. Thank you. The newspaper sent him out into the world and said, we would like you to put together little 1,500 word sketches of what you see out on the streets of London. And so he would describe the activity around a fruit cellar or a hackney coach stand. These were not stories, in so much that they did not have a beginning, middle, and end. They weren't a morality tale. They didn't have a conclusion or a denouement. They were sketches. He would simply show something. And I thought, gosh, that's exactly what we do with our cameras. We go out and show a little piece of the world that we think is captivating. And so Sketches by Boz became an important inspiration for me, as the more I thought about storytelling without a plot, storytelling without there really being a story. It's just showing. And here's an example of that. I was in I was in China, and I told my translator that I wanted to photograph a fishing village. And in my mind's eye, I had sort of old Chinese junk ships with funny looking sails and all that down on the river. Well, the translator said, "Sure, no problem. There's a fishing village not far from here. We can go photograph it." So we went. What I discovered was that fishing in China is no longer with quaint boats. That's just for tourists. Fishing in China is they take what you and I would call a field, a cornfield or something, and they dig it about 3 feet deep, line the entire thing with plastic, fill it with water, throw a few fish in there, and then just let them do what fish do for a year. And then a year later, they come back, drain the swamp, and down to the plastic, walk around and pick up all the fish. That's fishing in China. Well, this was a fishing village, but it was the dead of winter. And as we were driving through in the taxi cab, I saw probably the most cliche image in all of photography, which was the torn poster on the side of the wall. But it was Chinese. So I said, "Stop the cab. I'll jump out and make this picture." And these guys came running out of the building and said, it's through the translator, "It's cold. It's cold. You got to come in. You got to come in. And it's too cold to be out here." So we got invited inside. Turns out this is the village store. And these guys were all gathered to play mahjong. And I'm watching, and since I don't speak any Mandarin, all I could do is just sort of photograph. And all of a sudden, this guy right here, if you can see my mouse, turned and looked at me with a sort of a formal pose. And if that's not an invitation to take a picture, I can't recognize it. So I very quickly positioned my camera and took this snapshot. And I was dying to ask this guy why he had a glass eye and a wooden hand. But since I didn't speak Mandarin and the translator was in another room with some of the other photographers, I wasn't able to ever hear this guy's story. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, that's the story. The story is how photography makes these relationships possible, even though all we can learn is perhaps what someone looks like. Even though we'll never know more depth to the story, photography still brought us together for this moment. I clicked the shutter. He gave me a big smile. I gave him a big smile. That was the end of the relationship. So I put that story together along with what fishing is in China and some other pictures of them into one of these handmade, hand-sewn, printed on both sides of paper. So it's like a little tiny book, but a handmade artist book. And I call it The Fisherman with One Eye. And this to me has really enlivened my photography. The inspiration of not necessarily making artwork for the wall, not necessarily pre-visualizing what's going to happen, allowing the random to influence my life, to put together a group of images, 6, 10, 12, 15 maybe, that go together and tell us more than what we could probably learn from just one picture, and maybe adding a little text. This has been so inspirational to me. Seventh, I want to talk about Basho and Hemingway. And really, it's Hemingway that is the start of this. Do you guys know of something called a 6-word story? Have you ever heard the term a 6-word story? I hadn't either, but it turns out it's a big deal. And there is a website called 6-Word Stories, and it's exactly what you think it is. It's people trying to tell a small story in just 6 words. And the story goes that Ernest Hemingway, who was very famous for his short, curt, unflowery writing style, was challenged with a bar bet. And this bar patron asked Ernest Hemingway, he said, "I'll bet you cannot tell a story in just 6 words." And Hemingway said, "Of course I can. It's easy." And so they made the bet. And Hemingway said, "Baby shoes, for sale, never worn." That was the first 6 words. Isn't that marvelous? Baby shoes, for sale, never worn. So from that apocryphal story, we assume this is actually true, but it may not be. It may just be an apocryphal story. Someone started this whole thing called 6-Word Stories, and they're all over the internet now. And I thought it was fascinating, the idea of trying to construct a story with such tight restrictions, which of course reminded me of Basho and the 17 syllables of a haiku. And I thought, if it works for these guys, why can't it work for us photographers too? So we started this thing called Seeing in Sixes, and it was doubly inspired when I came across in the research for that project this quote from Orson Welles: "The enemy of art is the total lack of limitations." When you can do anything, it tends to make it more difficult. Somehow having a little bit of a structure helps. And so we thought, why not try to put together a story with 6, exactly, not 5, not 7, exactly 6 pictures. This is my wife's Uncle Kenny on the family farm in North Dakota. There's 4, there's 2. It started when I took the picture of Kenny playing gin. I was just walking by, family reunion. We've all had this kind of experience. A bunch of the older guys were playing cards, and I whipped out my camera and I took a picture, and the flash happened to be on, and so it has a flash photography look. But I loved this picture of his hands. And so I thought, well, I want to put this together with some pictures of his farm and his tools and his shop and his winter coats and etc. One day I was out photographing, and Kenny came walking out, and he was dressed rather nicely. And I thought, well, that's funny. It's not Sunday. He's not going to church, and he's probably not going to town. I wonder why he's so dressed up. And he walked out and he said, "Well, I suppose you're going to want to be taking a portrait of me now." And how do you not take a portrait with that kind of introduction? He said, "I know exactly how I want it done." And he walked over and sat down in his shop and put his hand up on this drawer and looked outside. And I made the portrait, and I thought, what a beautiful moment. What a fantastic connection. Years later, Kenny and Palma had both passed away, and I found these shoes. These were their Sunday shoes in the bottom of their closet, and made this picture. And that became the 6 pictures that made Kenny.
Brooks,
And I
can you
call
move
the
forward
project.
if you're one slide behind?
This slide is.
Yeah, we don't see the shoes or the portrait.
Oh,
We did earlier and
uh,
it flipped off.
I wonder if I'm having an internet glitch, because I see it on my screen.
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah, I've told you my campground here has somewhat shaky internet, so hopefully it'll keep up. But if it happens again, let me know, please.
Will do.
So from this idea of the 6 image story and the 6 images from this little project I called Uncle Kenny, which, by the way, I thought I was doing just for the family because it's our Uncle Kenny. But I've been amazed how many people have purchased this little chapbook, because I've discovered that Uncle Kenny is kind of a universal thing. Everybody in their family has an Uncle Kenny who's, maybe he is a machinist, or maybe he's a butcher, or maybe he's a farmer, but somewhere there's an Uncle Kenny. And so it connected with people in ways that surprised the heck out of me. But from that came this idea of 6 image projects. So in I think the first one we did was in 2016. We did a book project called Seeing in Sixes, where we solicited from LensWork readers 6 image projects. The idea being exactly 6 images. That meant, in the book format, 3 facing pages for every project. And they were the most creative, most fun, fantastic things. Here's one by a photographer named Jim Hans down in the desert Southwest. He calls this the fog of desert, and submitted these 6 images. And there's a little bit of text about how odd fog is in the desert. Doesn't happen very often. But one of the things that occurs to me is that if you and I were out with our cameras and we happen to stumble into this unusual situation, we might take a bunch of pictures of fog in desert. And when we get back from the trip and we're reviewing our images in Lightroom or whatever, the normal procedure would be to try to look through these and see which one is the best one, the one that we want to print and frame and hang above the fireplace, which is the one that rises to the level of being the best. But I'm not sure I can look at these 6 images and see that there's one of them that tells the entire story, or one of them that's better than the others. And in fact, I think it takes more than one picture to tell this story. And so he did so. Here's another example of that by a New York photographer named Lev Zimring, called Dogs and the City. And kind of reminds me of some other dog photographers, William Wegman and those kind of, Elliot Erwitt. And but he did this really, I thought, very funny project, but just 6. Could he add more? Probably he could get away with more. Probably he could get away with 1 or 2 less and still have an interesting little group of images. But why not 6? 6 is as good as any other number. So that came about from Ernest Hemingway and Basho. The next photographer I want to talk about is Wright Morris. Wright Morris is, again, maybe not the most well-known photographer. Some of you may be familiar with him, but there's an interesting story. Wright Morris was, he was such a good photographer that the Friends of Photography did a monograph of his work. So he's not a slouch in photographic circles by any means, but he was much better known as a novelist, an award-winning novelist. He spent one summer in, when was it? The late 40s or the early 50s. I've kind of forgotten now. One summer back on his family farm in the Midwest. It was Nebraska, Kansas, I can't remember where, but he went to the family farm and he photographed hundreds of images. He then took some of those images, not all of them, but some of them, and he put them together and wrote this book called The Home Place. And it's fiction because he's a novelist. So it's a fictional story that he punctuates in the book with his beautifully done, large format, 4x5 black and white negatives. They're gorgeous. And he wrote that story. A few years later, he wrote another fictional story called The Inhabitants. And he used pictures from the family farm from the same trip, and in some cases, even the same images in the second project that he had used in the first project. And I thought, wait a minute, you can't do that. But he did, and it worked, and it was fantastic, and both books were great. And then a few years later, he wrote a third book called God's Country and My People, again, using that same set of images. Some of the same ones had appeared in the previous two books, and a number of them hadn't. What he taught me was the value of image and text. This really is storytelling. And this was such a breakthrough for me when I discovered Wright Morris, because when I was a young photographer, I was taught that any photograph that needs words needs to be a better photograph. And so I was discouraged as a young photographer from using words. Only with trepidation would I try to apply a title. But Wright Morris showed me that there are ways to think about image and text that go beyond. So this is an example of the kind of work I was doing at the time. My my grandfather was a machine shop guy. And I grew up loving my grandfather and spending time in his machine shops. So I sort of have a soft spot in my heart for greasy tools and workbenches and garage guys and etc. And I found myself photographing these kinds of places. But I also discovered that they don't make very good wall art to hang above the fireplace, because who wants a picture of a greasy machine shop above there? But that doesn't mean that as a photograph, it doesn't have value. Well, I started showing some of this work and eventually put them together in these little handmade folios. And this guy in the middle here is a part of the story I want to tell. He was a metal scrap salvager that I
We don't
happened to
have that
stumble
shot.
across.
We're on the tools, not the guy.
Okay, well, let's give it a chance to see
Yeah,
if
give it a
it'll
minute to catch up.
upload. Okay. Hopefully it'll show up while I'm talking. This guy was a metal scrap salvager. And I stumbled onto him and asked him if I could make his portrait, and he said yes. And so I made this portrait. And I took this portrait into the local photo group that I was working with at the time in Portland, Oregon.
There we go.
And they didn't get it. They were, you know, nice guys and valuable friendships and whatnot, but they didn't understand why I was taking pictures of greasy tools and machine shops and these guys and etc. And I wasn't able to get them interested in it. But I kept bringing them week after week as I had new images, and eventually I brought in this metal scrap salvager picture. And for reasons that I now have long forgotten, I can't remember why, I started telling his story. And the more I started telling his story and his actions and his words, the more people got interested. And suddenly the questions shifted. They were no longer asking me about what lens I used and what aperture I used and what exposure and film and photographic stuff. They were asking me about the guy. And I thought, this is good. Somehow I've passed through some sort of barrier here that I've got them interested in the individual. So I took his story and I started putting the little a quote or a comment or something in the photographic paper itself. You probably can't read it because it's too small, so I'll read it for you. It says, he rolled a cigarette, spit, swore, and then asked me if I wanted some tea. Suddenly he becomes alive. this is how you use text and image together. If the text simply describes what's in the photograph, it's superfluous. If the photograph simply illustrates what's communicated in the text, then the photograph is superfluous. But if the text can add three-dimensionality, can add time, can add character to it, then it makes sense. So the book, my first book, was Made of Steel, is all that. It's 100 some odd pictures of tool benches and what they said that I thought was interesting while I was photographing their tool bench. The one that goes with the drills on the left is the guy said, you know, a good drill will last you all your life, but a crappy drill won't last through the weekend. And I thought, you know, that's life. That's now we've got something of this individual. So Wright Morris, I was inspired by Wright Morris because he gave me permission to think in terms of image and text and to become a little bit of a storyteller. We're getting close to the end, but the next one is Minor White. Minor White, again, a fairly well-known photographer. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with Minor White's work. He's sort of the Zen guru of photography. Minor White's famous for having said, don't photograph what it is, photograph what else it is. Otherwise, think of photography and as a metaphor. Think of photography as pointing to something bigger than what it is that you photograph. And so to me, that has become a very interesting part of how I pursue photography, is I constantly find myself looking for the metaphor. Now, here's a little story. I was down on the southern Washington coast near Long Beach, and down there they have these tidal sloughs, and the water goes out and in, you know, on a regular tidal schedule. And every time it comes in, it brings with it all this stuff floating on the top, little bubbles and sticks and whatnot. And for some reason, I became absolutely fascinated with these patterns and spent the better part of 3 days photographing them. And this image that you're seeing now, I hope you're seeing it anyway, is actually pretty true to the color of what was there. It was sort of greenish, slack water. And I think we can all agree this isn't a very interesting photograph. And when I find that I have this kind of thing staring me in Lightroom, I like to do what I call PBPA, photography by pooping around. I just start playing. And with this image, oh, and sometimes I'll flip things and I'll do colors and all kinds of stuff, warp. I mean, there's so much you can do in Photoshop with digital images. And if you don't like it, you can just undo it. But in this case, I decided for grins to go to an extreme contrast, way more contrast than you can normally apply in Photoshop or Lightroom. So I had to do it several times. And I came up with this. And suddenly, this to me was no longer water. It was no longer a tidal slough. Everybody, you know, comes up with what they think it is. But to me, what it was the night sky. It was nebula and stars and galaxies. And I thought, I wonder if I have more of these. So
We haven't seen that one yet, Brooks. We're waiting for that to come up.
For the Starry Night one?
Yes.
Oh, come on. Sorry for the internet connection problems.
Okay.
But I'm going to hold here until it comes up. So what I ended up doing was searching through all the other images of the tidal slough until I found,
there it goes.
Yeah, until I found a number of them that could be converted through this kind of contrast and turned into the night sky. And I titled this project, which again is, I think there are 10 images or something like that. I titled this project Worlds Within Worlds, because to me, it was fascinating that I was looking down at a small thing on planet Earth, but yet it reminded me of a huge night sky above our heads. So worlds within worlds became the project. Looking for metaphors, though, that's Minor White taught us to look for metaphors. To me, this felt like some sort of moment of worship, almost as though the tree is holding its arms up to the moon. And so it became an interesting picture. And once I had that feeling, then processing became how do I emphasize that feeling? And so all the tonal decisions and cropping decisions and all of that became a function of that metaphor that I wanted to photograph. Here's a seagull flying just above the water. Hopefully you can see this image already. Um, just above
No,
the water.
we have the moon up now.
You have the moon up now? Okay. I could rewind and tell the whole story again, but you'll remember it, I'm sure. This next image, as soon as it comes up, is a seagull flying just a foot above some very turbulent water near where I lived in Anacortes. And I thought, isn't this to a large degree kind of what the art life is all about? Is that we're trying to do something with our photography that's slightly above the mundane existence of everyday life.
There we go.
We all have to wash the dishes, we all have to pay the bills, we all have to mow the lawn. But every once in a while we get these moments where we're sort of hovering just above the humdrum of everyday existence. And it's such a precious moment. And it's so easy for us to get sucked back into everyday life. But being a photographer is a privilege and an honor, and we should really enjoy every moment that we have. Last is Todd Walker. Todd Walker is not a very well-known photographer. He did not pursue commercial publication. He did not pursue gallery representation. So he has a regional following in the desert Southwest, but his story to me is so fascinating. Todd Walker made his own books. I interviewed Todd Walker for an early issue of LensWork, and he explained to me that he was bothered by the fact that he would work his tail off to produce something in photography and send it into a publisher and have it rejected. And, he was so interested in getting his work out into the world and so disappointed every time he got rejected that he thought, I'm going to let go of the idea that someone else has to give me permission to share my work, and I'll just start publishing myself. So he bought a press and he would print his own books. And I asked him, how many copies of the books would you print? And he said, well, I always start off with 500 sheets of paper, but he used a one color press. Matter of fact, he had the same color or the same press that I showed early on in the presentation that we had for LensWork. And he said, I would print the cyan, all the cyan 500 pages. Then I'd put those 500 pages back in the press and I'd print the yellow. And then I'd put them back in the press and print the magenta, and then back in the press and print the black. And he said, invariably, a bunch of them didn't register properly. They were crooked. The press would eat paper and crunch it up. And so he said, I might start off with 500 sheets of paper, but by the time it was all done, I might be only had 10 books. But the idea of self-publishing to me was fascinating. Now, keep in mind, this was long before Blurb, long before Lulu, long before MagCloud, long before PDFs. You and I have the ability to self-publish now in ways that previous generations couldn't even dream of. Now here's, I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but in order to explain the story, I have to give you a little backstory about it. In a funny sort of way, I'm probably the one photographer in the world who can't get published in any other photography magazines. Because of LensWork, I'm kind of the competitor. And so no one's going to publish my work because, well, because. And I can't publish my own work in LensWork because that's kind of tacky and self-serving. But Todd Walker reminded me that maybe we have to think of a way that doesn't require the permission of someone else. Maybe we can be our own self-publishers. So I started publishing this PDF. I call it Kokoro, which is Japanese for the heart mind. And Lafcadio Hearn translated that term best when he said, it's the equivalent of the heart of the matter. So that's what Kokoro means in Japanese. I publish this roughly every other month. Each issue of Kokoro has 3 or 4 or maybe as many as 6 little projects in it, where I can explore an idea, a subject, a theme, or whatever. Here's one called Tree Bones. I hope you can see the title of Tree Bones. And then
We can.
here's a little text, and some more images. These are all from up in the Sierras, up at Patriarch Grove, literally anywhere I can find these tree skeletons and photograph them. And I discovered that I had this as a potential project because I was doing that David Bales exercise of dividing the piles. I have lots and lots and lots of pictures of trees. How do you be a photographer and not have pictures of trees? But I started dividing them one day between trees that were like dead or winter and trees that had foliage and fruit. And I realized I had all of these pictures of trees that didn't have any leaves on them. Here's that same one again of the worship. And oops. And so I put them together in this project called Tree Bones. Each issue of Kokoro has, like I say, 3 or 4 projects like that. I put them on my personal website, brooksjensenarts.com. They're free. People can download them and enjoy them. And for me, it's a way to share my work. And it's outside of commerce. I'm not interested in selling things. I'm just interested in sharing and making connections with people. And with free PDFs, I'm able to do it all over the globe. And it doesn't cost anything to do it. You can make PDFs with Photoshop, and probably most of you have Photoshop. If you don't have Photoshop, you might have Lightroom. You can make a collection of images into a PDF in Lightroom. We can be our own publishers and distribute our own work. And it gives us more than a vehicle to share our work. What it provides that I think is incredibly important for the creative life is momentum. Because I produce one of these every other month, I'm constantly working on things. And nothing is harder, I think, in the creative life than to start from a dead stop. If all you do is pick up your camera once a year for 2 weeks of vacation, that's really hard to do, to keep the creative juices going and to start from dead stop. But if you're constantly doing little things, it keeps the momentum going. So, as Isaac Newton so famously said, if I've seen further than others, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. And those giants are the people I've been talking about in Those Who Inspire Me and Why. So, like I said, there's lots more people who I haven't discussed that are available. And if you're interested in my little, 5-10 minute discussion of them, please take a look at it over at lensworkonline.com and find inspiration out there in the world that can keep your momentum going. So that's it.